on YouTube. Let me start by sharing my screen. You can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I would just do first, welcome to everyone. This is the OpenGeoHub Summer School 2021 virtual edition. We are excited to have a lot of fantastic keynotes, and we expect a lot of discussion. It is a bit different summer school being virtual. So it's the first one we're doing purely virtual. Last year we did a hybrid. So it will be a bit shorter than usual, but we hope to have equally interesting program, and we have equally interesting presenters as every year. Just a short note about us. We are the OpenGeoHub Foundation. Our slogan is Connect, Create, Share, Repeat. We are non-for-profit. We don't make any profit of these events. And we are here to promote open source and open data. And we want to help organizations make better open data and open source software. Just a few words before we start. So this is a virtual event. There might be technical problems. I just want to warn everyone. It's not a simple thing to do, but we explain you. We had this Q&A session, and we try to explain you all the ways you can avoid some malfunctioning. We have a 3-day program. Each day it's split in 2 blocks. Each block is a 1 Zoom session, so you have to disconnect and you have to connect to the different Zoom session after every second block. So it's about 6 blocks. So every day 1 block, 2 blocks, and so you have to disconnect. To ask questions, you can use Zoom, but you can also raise a hand, and you can also use MetaMost. For more complex questions, we advise to use MetaMost, because then the history of your question stays and we can track it every day. This is the photo from the last year. We had to keep a distance. Also, today to make a group photo is also challenging. This is a photo from last year. This year we're happy. We have a lot of registrations. Almost 350 people or more expressed interest to join. And also we are super happy that distribution of lecturers, it's kind of a distribution of interest for different lectures. It's kind of uniform. We don't usually get that. So Edzer and Hannah did a very good job in selecting the lecturers. Some important instructions: unmute yourself if somebody try to turn on the microphone and makes phone calls, whatever, you are risking of being removed, so you'll be breaking the rules. Also, please respect session chairs, which are Edzer and Hannah. Today, session chair is Professor Edzer Pebezma from University of Munster. We are live broadcasting this on YouTube, so also have that in mind. We will be strict about time, so you will get a 5 minutes warnings if you're a presenter, and then 1 minute before the end of the session. As I said, best ask question via MetaMost, but if you want, you can also ask via Zoom. If you want to make a public statement, or if you want to talk about this, then please contact us via our Twitter channel. So you can use our Twitter channel, which you can find on the top here in the corner. You can find all our channels, so you can contact us through these channels. Best use Twitter. We recommend using Twitter to contact us and send public questions or public comments. We have the hackathon. I explained the rules. I'm not going to mention them now, but you have to submit before 1 minute before, or the minute before the start of each of the session. Otherwise, you are not participating. And the questions, your answers, you have to submit through a MetaMost channel, or you send through private message. We'll have a social activities every day. Today at 3 o'clock, we will break up and we will go to this little improvised Wonder Me session, where you can meet your colleagues, and this is not going to be video recorded broadcast, so this is offline, but you can connect with the colleagues and you can chat. You will see pictures, etc. Also, just a very brief announcement: next week we continue with more open source, open data. We have a workshop here in Wageningen, and it's a hybrid workshop. If you're interested, also you can join from Monday We have sessions on spatial temporal machine learning and visualization of data, but this is more focused on this European project, Open Data Science. So this is it from me. It's very brief. As brief as I could. I will pass it on now to Edzer, who's going to introduce the first speaker of the day. So please, Edzer, take over.
Thank you, Tom, for this general introduction. So I'm Edzer Pevers. I'm together with Hannah, the co-chair of this summer school. That means that we sort of ask invited speakers for the program and discuss the form and so on. This is the 15th year, right, Tom, that you and your co-workers do summer schools, and roughly the 20th summer school, because there have been a couple of years where there were 2 per year. So this is really a great event and a continuing success story, I would say. But I would like to introduce to you now Hannah Meyer as the first speaker. Hannah Meyer is full professor at the Institute for Landscape Ecology of the University of Münster in Germany, where she leads the research group on remote sensing and spatial modeling. Hannah, as I said, is also one of the program chairs of this summer school. So please go ahead, Hannah.
Yeah, let me check if I can share the screen.
Can you share the screen?
I just have to get my Zoom windows organized. So, 1 second. Okay, I think now you should see my presentation, do you?
I can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, well, then thank you, Edzer, for the introduction. Also, thank you to Tom for the opportunity to give this workshop here at the summer school. And what I would like to do with you in the next roughly 1 hour is to build on content from the previous summer schools and guide you through the ideas and application of mapping and increasing the area of applicability of spatial prediction models. But yeah, before we go into detail on how to estimate the area of applicability, we should probably start with motivation why we might be interested in estimating an area of applicability. And the background is that in the past years, we've seen a huge increase in the development of global maps of the environment that are developed on the basis of machine learning. To just show you 4 examples, what we see here is a global map of a specific leaf area or global maps of soil properties, like for example here, soil organic carbon in the topsoil, or many global maps of biodiversity information, like for example here, global map of nematodes in the soil, or many of you might be aware of this example here because it has been heavily discussed after publication in Science, a global map of potential tree cover, and derived from that the global tree restoration potential. And these maps that we have just seen have a lot in common because the methodology to develop these maps is more or less identical, at least in its basic concepts. And in each case, the starting point is a set of reference data of the variable to be mapped. And depending on the variable of interest, these can be, for example, measurements, for example, from climate stations, or soil sample records, or vegetation surveys, or other field sampled ground truth data that are often also compiled in large databases. So the starting point is that we have knowledge about the variable of interest, or the variable to be mapped at these visited locations here, to just show some examples here on the map. But now the aim and the challenge for global mapping is that we want to fill these gaps between the training samples to arrive at spatial continuous maps of different environmental variables. And to do this, machine learning has become quite popular because of the ability to fit nonlinear relationships between variables. And the idea in view to spatial mapping is that on the one side, we have our field data or our response variable, so reference data of our variable to be mapped. And on the other hand, we have a set, or we compile a set of so-called predictor variables that we assume might have a relationship with our response variable. And often these predictor variables are information derived from remote sensing imagery or from elevation models, or there might also be previously modeled data sets, for example, on climate patterns or soil properties. And the idea is that we then feed both predictor and response variables into a machine learning algorithm. And very often this is a random forest algorithm, at least for the examples that we've seen on the previous slide. And the idea is that the machine learning algorithm learns the relationship between the predictors and the response variable by itself, and to fit the nonlinear relationships between these variables. And once the model is trained, the idea is that we can apply it to the entire global set of the predictor variables so that we can make spatial predictions of our variable of interest. However, while the number of global maps that are produced via this workflow is increasing, there's also increasingly discussion about the value and quality of such maps, which recently led to many newspaper and scientific journal papers that question the results of the global maps that are created based on that workflow. For example, here a paper published, or not a paper, newspaper article published in Die Zeit with the title "Wenn die KI daneben liegt," in English, "If artificial intelligence is wrong," or "Researchers find flaws in high-profile study on trees and climate," both explicitly addressing the tree restoration potential that we have just seen. Or here, just published a few days ago, "Conservation needs to break free from global priority mapping." Or here, a paper published in Nature that is questioning some of the methods in more general with the title "Deep Trouble for Deep Learning." So there is increasing the loss of trust in the maps created that way, that which might lead us to the question if we maybe have been too ambitious by aiming at applying machine learning to map the entire world, and as a consequence that we deal with the question why these models might fail in making reliable spatial predictions. And to approach this question, let's have a look at probably the largest challenge that we have in a prediction process. So what we do when we apply machine learning to make spatial predictions is that we train and validate our models based on these field samples. However, when we look here at typical locations of these field samples, we see that they're usually not evenly spread, but that we often have large gaps where we make predictions for, but where we initially don't have any support of training data. And by now making predictions for these areas, what we do is that we transfer the model to a new space, and we assume that the relationships that have been learned based on the training data are still valid for these new locations. However, these new locations or this new space might considerably differ in its environmental properties compared to what has been observed in the training data. And this leads to the question, what actually happens if the algorithm has never seen such environmental properties? And this is a problem insofar as machine learning algorithms are known to be very well able to deal with complex and nonlinear relationships between predictor and response variables. But at the same time, they're very weak in extrapolation. So whenever we have gaps here in the predictor space, for example, here where we don't have any training data in these predictor for these values of the predictor variable, this can be very problematic because the model simply has not get any opportunity to get knowledge about these areas, and it has not learned how the relationships between predictor and response might look like for these parts of the predictor space where we don't have any support of training data. So to avoid that we make predictions for these areas, what we need is a measure for unknown space. So we want to make sure that we only apply our trained machine learning model to environments that it also has been trained for, so that we avoid that we make predictions for those parts where our model has not gained any knowledge and where we cannot expect that our model can make any reliable predictions. So we need to identify unknown space or unknown environments, and we define unknown space here as space with environmental predictor conditions that are very different compared to what has been part of the training data set. So let's assume we have 3 predictor variables, one called A, one called B, one called C here, and each training data point is located somewhere in this case 3-dimensional predictor space. And if we now want to make predictions for a new data point, for example, for this one here, what we want to know is if this new environment is known to the model or not. And our suggestion to do that is a dissimilarity index that is based on distances in a weighted predictor space. and to use this dissimilarity index as a baseline to derive what we call the area of applicability of a prediction model that we define as the area where the model was enabled to learn about relationships and where we assume that the estimated model performance holds. So I want to use this slide to describe the method in a bit more detail before we go into application. So what we see here are some arbitrary training data point in a two-dimensional predictor space. And in this predictor space, each predictor variable has been scaled and weighted according to the estimated importance within the trained machine learning model. And the first step towards the dissimilarity index is that we calculate the average distance between all training data in our training data set. Then the next and important step is that we quantify dissimilarity within the training data. And we do this by taking the cross-validation folds into account. So what we see here in different colors are still the same training data, but now the color corresponds to the membership of the different folds that are used during cross-validation. And if we now only look at one training data point, for example, this one here that is marked with that red circle, what we do to calculate the dissimilarity is that we look at the distance to the nearest training data point that is not located in the same cross-validation fold. And to derive the dissimilarity index from that, we divide this distance, so this distance to the nearest training data point, by the average distance within the training data, which we calculated based on the previous step. And in the end, we do this for each data point in our training data set, so that for each training data point, we get a dissimilarity index. And this is the baseline for our delineation of the area of applicability. What we see here in the box plot are the dissimilarity index values for each training data point in our training data set. And what we use as a threshold to define the area of applicability is the outlier removed maximum dissimilarity index of the training data that we used for model training. And this means that if a new data point is more dissimilar than the dissimilarity we observed within the training data, we consider it as outside the area of applicability because the model was not trained on such environments and the dissimilarity to the training environments is larger compared to what we accounted for during cross-validation. And the idea is now that we can do this for each new data point. So for example, for each new pixel or for each new location. For each new data set, for example, for each new training, for each new data point, for example, this one here, where we want to make predictions for, we estimate if this new data point is within the area of applicability. So we calculate the dissimilarity index by looking at the distance to the nearest training data point to calculate the dissimilarity index. In this example, it's 0.92. So we then next compare this dissimilarity index value with our threshold based on a cross-validated training data. And in this case, it was just above 0.2. So in this example here, this new data point would be outside the area of applicability. So we would expect that we cannot, or we should not make predictions for this data point because we cannot expect that our model can make any reliable predictions for this point because it is too different compared to what has been observed in a training data set. Yeah, and before we now go into practice and play around with data ourselves, let's quickly explore how that looks like for a case study. So what we see here is a set of bioclimatic variables that we use as predictor variables. And based on these predictor variables, we simulated a virtual response variable that we see here in the plot to the right. And to simulate a typical training data, we randomly sampled 50 data points and used them as training data. So these are the points that you see here marked with a red marker. And we use them as training data to train a random forest model to learn the relationships between the predictors and the response variable based on these 50 training data points with the aim to make predictions of our virtual response variable for entire Europe. And we can see the results of this year. So what we have here again is a reference data set, so our simulated response variable, and what we see here is a prediction based on the trained random forest model. So we see that technically we can make predictions for the entire area, so here for entire Europe. So now the question is if we really should have done so. And therefore, we calculate the dissimilarity index that is shown here with yellow colors indicating areas that have a very high dissimilarity index. So we see that especially here in the Alps, so at the west coast of Norway, we have areas that are very different in their predictor properties. So they feature very different bioclimatic variables, so different climate information compared to what has been observed in the training data set. Yeah, we expect that yeah, we might also find yeah, larger model errors in these areas, because we cannot expect that our model can make reliable predictions for these environments. And what's quite nice to see when we compare this dissimilarity index or the patterns of the dissimilarity index with the true prediction error, which is the difference between the reference and the prediction here, we see that this nicely corresponds. So also here at the Alps and in the west coast of Norway, we have a large prediction error. Yeah, we could or we could have the hypothesis that where we have a high dissimilarity, or that our model could not deal well with areas where we have a high dissimilarity index, because yeah, the model was simply not trained on such environments. So when we then use a threshold for the area of applicability that we derive from the cross-validated training data, we can come up with a suggestion of how to present the predictions for our case study here. So our suggestion is that we present the predictions that we have already shown here again, but this time only for the area of applicability. So everything that is shown here in a pinkish color are areas that are outside the area of applicability according to our definition. So we cannot expect that our model can make reliable predictions for these areas, and we expect that we cannot make any assumptions or any estimates about the model performance for these environments, and therefore we should not present predictions for these locations in order to avoid a misinterpretation of the predictions. Okay, so much for the quick introduction, and now we should move on into practice and see how we can apply the area of applicability for our own prediction tasks. And the practice or the exercise I would like to work with you on is the example of a land cover classification. Those of you that already, have already been on a previous summer school might know this example already. So the idea is that we want to classify land cover for the area of Münster based on satellite images. So we want to translate this information here that we get from a satellite image into a nice map of land cover for the area of Münster. But we want to do that under consideration of the area of applicability. So we want to see for which parts of Münster we can make reliable predictions, and for which areas we should probably or better not present any predictions, because we cannot expect that our model can make reliable predictions there, because it has not trained on such predictor properties. And when we have worked on that, we want to also have a look how we can increase the area of applicability. And this was also the challenge or the task I gave you to solve, and we will come to a sample solution later on during this presentation. Okay, so the idea is that we want to produce a land cover classification for Münster. However, there is a challenge in that prediction, and this is that we assume that we don't have any reference data available for Münster. So the data set that I will give you, and that some of you might already looked at, consists of reference data from 4 areas in Germany. One of them is Münster, but we will exclude it for model training. So the idea is that we want to train a model based on 3 areas, but we want to develop a model that is or as generalizable as possible, so that it can also be applied to make predictions for Münster. And we will test the success of that by looking into the reference data for Münster that we are not going to use for model training, but we will only use them for validation to see if our model can be applied to the area of Münster or not. Yeah, so this is a challenge, and now I will switch to R to go into practice with that, and you will find all code and data on my GitHub repository if you go on that link, but I think, yeah, it should also be already in the MetaMost channel. So I directly switch to R. So you still see my R code, do you? Yeah, okay, good. So you got a markdown file that looks similar to this. So mine is called machine learning area of applicability with solution, because it already contains a sample solution to the challenge I gave you, but the rest is more or less identical. So you can follow most parts of the code, and I will publish the rest just after the session, so that you have the complete code available later on. So to start our land cover classification, let's first load a couple of libraries that we will load, that we will need, and I won't go into detail here now. And then let's start with exploring the data. And the first data set we will load is the predictor data set that we will also use to produce our land cover map. I call it Sentinel Münster here, or ZenMS. And we can have a look into this data set if we plot it here. So this data set consists of a couple of spectral channels from a Sentinel-2 satellite image from the area of Münster. They are called B02 to B11. We also have an NDVI image here, and some texture information, which is here the NDVI, or the standard deviation of the NDVI in a 5x5 pixel environment, and there should come some more actually, but somehow it seems to be quite slow at the moment for any reasons. What was the last row? Okay, I stopped that for a second.
Demos always get a bit nasty. There was a question about the code you're sharing on the GitHub. We will share the link.
Yeah, it's already on MetaMost, the link, I assume. Yeah, should be. Okay, so what happens here? Okay, probably I should start again. One second. Okay, I take the risk to plot them again, so it worked nicely earlier on. Yeah, now it works. Okay, so this is our set of predictor variables that we will use as a baseline to develop our land cover classification, or that we can use as a baseline. We don't have to, so we will discuss that later on. So we have the spectral channels, we have NDVI information, and we also have latitude, longitude information. We discussed quite a lot about that in the previous summer schools, and we will come back to that later on as well. And we will see that we will keep them here to make a point very clear. But for now, let's just keep them there and discuss that later on. We can also plot the satellite images as a true color composite to get an idea about the area that we want to classify. So this is the area of Münster that we want to make predictions for. Yeah, to show you or to give you an idea about the predictor data set that we have available here. So then let's move on to our reference data, which is the second ingredient of our machine learning model. And I prepared a data set for you that I call train sites here. And when we look into the information that we have here, we see that in this data frame, we have all the information that we already found in the predictor stack. So we have the spectral information, we also have the NDVI, and we also have latitude, longitude values for different training locations from different regions in Germany. And now I mentioned earlier on that we have regions, or that we have 4 regions here in Germany, and that we want to exclude Münster from model training and use that only for prediction. So the first step that we do now is that we remove all data points from Münster here, because we don't want to use them for model training, but we only want to use it for model validation. So let's first start by splitting the data into a training data set, which is the entire data set except everything that is located in Münster, and we have a validation data set that is everything else. So that's basically the data for the Münster area. Okay, so can have a look again, or we can also have a look at the regions that are included now in the training data set. So we have Freiburg, Jena, and Lübeck now included in the training data set. And the aim is now to develop a model that is able to make predictions of the land cover based on these 3 regions, but also for the new region of Münster without getting any training data from the area of Münster. Okay, then because we only have limited time, what we do first is that we reduce our data for model training. So what we do here is that we only take 15% of each training polygon for model training, because the data set consists of different training polygons, and we reduce the data set so that only 15% of the pixels that are covered by a polygon are used here for model training. And we can do that via create data partition from the caret package. And we also remove all data that have missing values here, so that we avoid any troubles during the model training, so that we then end up with a data set that only contains the data from all areas that are not Münster, and we reduced it to 15% of the data, so that we hopefully manage to run this exercise here within the last 30 minutes that we have left. Okay, then next we define our predictor and response variable for our model. And as predictor variables, we now use all information that we have available from our predictor data set. We'll discuss that later on, but for now, let's just simply start with that. So we use the spectral data, the NDVI and latitude and longitude values as predictors, and as response variable, we use the column named label, because this one, if we look back into the data frame here, contains information about the land cover class. Okay, and then we can already go into the model training procedure, and we will do that here via the caret package. We have other options available, of course, as well, but the area of applicability is for now only implemented to work with the caret package. That's why we will also do the model training here via caret to keep it more simple. So we now start with a very basic workflow of a machine learning model. And to do this, we first define how we want to do our cross-validation for error assessment and for model tuning. And we do that first in a very default way by doing a simple random 3-fold cross-validation, which means that we randomly divide our training data into 3 folds. And the idea is that we then repeatedly leave data out and use them not for model training, but for model validation, so that we can test how well our model is able to make predictions for new data that have not been included in a training data set. so that we can estimate the model performance for data the model was not trained for. Okay, we can do that via the train control function. So we say here that the method is cross-validation. We have 3 folds, and per default, this will be a random cross-validation. And so the data are randomly divided into folds. Okay, then let's do the model training. And to do this, we feed into the train function the predictors, the response. We say that we're going to do a random forest model here. We use the kappa index as a metric to do the model tuning. And we do that via the random cross-validation that we just defined. And to speed things up, we reduce the number of trees in that random forest model to 50 here, because otherwise it takes quite long. So let's run this. Okay, and when we then look into the model results, what we see here is that apparently our model is very well able to make predictions for new data, because we can see here that we have an accuracy of 0.98 and a kappa of 0.98 as well. And keeping in mind that the maximum value for accuracy and kappa that we could get is a value of 1, we could speak here of a nearly perfect prediction model. So we could expect that our model should be well able to make predictions about the land cover here. Okay, so that's good news. So let's apply our model to make predictions for Münster. So we expect that this should work nicely, because we've seen that the estimated model performance is nearly perfect. So we make the predictions by feeding the model and the raster stack into the predict function here, and then we can plot everything, for example, with a tmap package here, and then we get the following results here. So this is our land cover classification that should correspond to our estimated kappa and accuracy of nearly 1. And when we look into the labels, we see here that the entire city of Münster is apparently classified as open soil here, and the rest, or basically all the rest here, is planted fields. So when we look back into the RGB composite here, we see that that doesn't fit at all. So apparently our estimated model performance of accuracy and kappa of nearly 1 doesn't correspond to the prediction patterns that we see here now. And to understand what happened here, or why we have that mismatch between the prediction patterns that we see and the estimated model performance. Let's quickly go to the slide that I wanted to show. We could go back to this slide here that you probably already seen at the previous summer schools, because we quickly have to make clear here what happened when we estimated the model performance via the random cross-validation, and therefore we could zoom in into the study area here to the location of 3 training polygons, one here overlaid on grassland, one on cropland, and one on a road feature. And what we see here are the individual pixels that are overlaid by the training polygons. And what we have to keep in mind is that each pixel overlaid by a polygon is treated as an individual training data point here. And when we now make a data split in a random way, so by doing a random cross-validation, what we do is that we divide our data randomly into folds, and then we repeatedly train our models by keeping one fold back and use it for model validation instead of for model training. And if we do that via random cross-validation, a first random selection might look like this. So we randomly pick some data points from these polygons and use them for validation instead of using them for model training. We do that with a second fold, with a third fold, and so on, until each data point is left out once and is used for model validation instead of used for model training. And when we do this via random cross-validation, and we have such clustered data as we have here with these training polygons, what we actually do with a random cross-validation is that we answer the question how well our model performs on very similar locations, because we use the neighboring pixels that we used already for model training. We use them now for model validation, and in this way we are only testing how well our model is able to make predictions for very similar locations compared to those that have already been part of the training data set. However, what we actually want to know is how well our model is able to make predictions for the area of Münster, and we cannot answer this question by using a random cross-validation. So instead, what would be an obvious solution to do here is that we perform a leave region out cross-validation, where we split our data into 3 folds again, but this time not randomly, but that we do it in a way that we always leave one of the 3 regions here out and use them for model validation instead of for model training, so that we can always estimate how well our model is able to make predictions for a completely new region that has not been part of the training data set. Okay, so we can do this for our data set here as well. So we adjust the model that we have trained by adjusting the cross-validation strategy. So we use here the create spacetime folds function from the cast package, and define here the folds in a way so that in each iteration of the cross-validation, we always leave one of the regions out and test how well we can make predictions for a region that has not been included in the training data set, and feed those information into the train control function. And then we run the same process again. So the code here is identical. The only thing that we swap is here the train control information. So here we specify that we're now going to do a spatial cross-validation instead of a random cross-validation. And to be a bit more specific about the spatial cross-validation, what we do here is a leave region out cross-validation to test how well our model is able to make predictions for a new region that has not been part of the training data set. Okay, and if we do that, we can now compare our performance estimates, and we now do that here via box plot. So what we see here is the estimate for the random cross-validation, which had a kappa index of nearly 1, and with the spatial cross-validation, we see now a bit more negative result. So apparently the ability of our model to make predictions for a new region was much lower compared to what was estimated based on a random cross-validation, with an average kappa of roughly around 0.5. And to answer this question, if this is a meaningful estimate about the model performance when we want to apply it to Münster, we can now compare our prediction with the validation data that we had available for Münster. So we predict or we use our trained model to make predictions for the validation data, so for the reference data that we had available for Münster, and have a look how the performance looks there with our completely independent data. And what we get here when we use those independent test data is that we get an accuracy of 0.6 and a kappa of 0.55. So that quite nicely corresponds to our estimate, what we got here with the leave region out cross-validation. Okay, but now let's move on to what we actually wanted to do, which is the estimation about the area of applicability. So we have seen that technically we can apply the model to make predictions for the entire area of Münster, but we have seen that the predictions are not looking very promising. And to have a look if this might be due to the problem that the area of Münster is too different in its predictor properties compared to what has been part of the training data set, we now run the area of applicability function to estimate the area of applicability of this prediction model. And I do that in parallel to speed things up a little bit. So all we need to do here is to use the area of applicability functions called AOA and feed in the predictor stack and the model and yeah, then it takes a while, and then we should get the information about the dissimilarity index and about the area of applicability of the prediction model. Okay, I don't know how long it takes. That's why I maybe directly go to the slide, or maybe I give it a second.
You can go to the slide and then come back just to validate.
Usually it should be finished within a minute, but it seems like it's a bit slow at the moment. Etsa, I can't hear you. It looks like you're saying something, but
just give it a few seconds.
Yeah.
The minute takes usually longer when you are presenting, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But we have a lot of questions for you. Don't forget to leave time for questions. And if your computer is presenting, it's also using processing, by the way, so it slows down.
Yeah.
We need a progress bar, right?
Yeah, the green bars, yeah. But maybe you can show us the slides and then you come back to it.
Yeah. Okay, so this is how the result will look like once it's finished. So this was our original prediction here. And if we look how much is left when we apply the area of applicability, you see a black figure here, because actually there's nothing left. So the entire area of Münster was outside the area of applicability. Yeah, apparently the entire area was too different in its predictor properties compared to what has been part of the training data set, so that we could not expect that our model could make reliable predictions for Münster, which, yeah, quite nicely corresponds to our opinion when we look at the predictions, because it does not correspond to what we would or how we would classify the area of Münster based on our knowledge when we look at the composite here. So this was also the challenge that I gave you to solve, because that was the point where the R markdown stopped that I gave you, and I asked you the question, so why is this the case? So why is the entire area of Münster outside of the area of applicability, and why yeah, can we not expect that the model can make predictions for this? And I think I only got one submission, but I didn't look into that yet, or I only looked at that very shortly, and it looked like we came to the same conclusion of what to do here now. And I quickly want to go to a sample solution here, or guide you through that, and we might get a first idea or first impression of why this might be the case, that the entire area of Münster is outside of the area of applicability when we look at the variable importance score of our prediction model here. Because what we see here is we see here the variable importance ranking, and the longer the bar here, the more important the variable or the respective variable here is here to define the prediction patterns that we have seen. And we see that in many cases, the variables longitude and latitude are identified here as very important variables in the model, which means that they are mainly responsible to drive the prediction patterns that we have just seen. But if we keep in mind that we trained our model based on locations in Germany that have very different latitude and longitude values compared to the area of Münster where we apply our model for, it's quite unlikely that these variables are responsible for the problem that we cannot apply our model to a new region, because the model simply, or we cannot simply transfer that model because it has been trained based on latitude and longitude. And of course, if we move far beyond these latitude and longitude values, we cannot expect that our model can make any reliable predictions, because it has simply never seen such latitude and longitude values and doesn't know how to deal with these values for latitude and longitude. So the idea, and this is a follow-up from the previous summer school from the last years, is that the idea would be, or one solution would be, in order to develop a model that is able to make predictions beyond the study regions used for model training, that we select our predictor variables based on the ability to make predictions beyond the regions used for training. And we can do that via a forward feature selection that works together with spatial cross-validation. So what we do here is that we feed in, again, the same spatial cross-validation fold, so a leave region out cross-validation, and we ask the algorithm to select only those predictor variables that lead to the best performance in view to a new region that has not been included in the training data set. And because I don't have much time left, I will not run that now, but show you the results, what happens if when we run this forward feature selection on this data set. And this is a plot that we get, or the information that we get. We only look at this plot here now. So the variables that were selected as the best variables to make predictions for a new region were in the end only the band 11 and the NDVI and the NDVI standard deviation, as well as the third channel of our Sentinel image. And each other variable was rated as being either counterproductive or not important in order to make predictions beyond the regions used for model training. And we also see that, or that's also reflected in the performance estimates. What we see here again is the leave region out cross-validation results. And we see here the results for the original model and the same after variable selection. So when we only use the variables that are meaningful in view to making predictions for new regions, we see that we could significantly improve the performance of our prediction model. And when we then apply our prediction model again to the area of Münster, we see that our predictions now look much more reliable. So in orange here we have settlement. We also have here now a mixture between open soil and planted field and forest. So that corresponds much better to our RGB composite here. And we see in this plot here that we don't have a black image here anymore, but apparently the entire area of Münster is now within the area of applicability, because we only used variables that could be used to make predictions beyond the regions used during model training. And this does not only apply for the case study that we have seen here with the extreme example of using latitude and longitude values, but we could also quickly have a look at some initial results of using the area of applicability for the global prediction models. So for example, here the global map of soil nematodes, and we see here the predictions that are left when we reproduce the example based on the original data set with the original predictor variables, and we see the results here after variable selection. So we see that we could increase the area of applicability a lot by using only variables that can be used to make predictions beyond the locations used for model training. So to sum up, to give you a few minutes left for questions, I guess, we all agree that the maps that we develop with machine learning are not just nice, colorful maps, but we want to use them, as a baseline for subsequent modeling, or as a tool for planning, for example. And we have seen that there are some points where we need to be very careful. So, for example, standard validation procedures lead to an over-optimistic view on the prediction performance if we have especially when we have clustered data. And therefore, when we have clustered training data, we need spatial cross-validation to estimate the performance of those prediction models to make predictions beyond the region used for model training. We have also seen that we have a high risk of overfitting when using too many or unsuitable predictor variables. And the solution for that might be that we use a spatial variable selection to only select variables that can be used to transfer the model to a new region. And machine learning models can only make meaningful predictions for environments they were trained for, and therefore predictions should only be presented for the area of applicability, so that we avoid making predictions for areas where it's too uncertain that we should consider, or that we should better not consider them for either subsequent modeling or planning. Yeah, so our suggestion is to include these steps to the modeler standard toolkit to avoid misplanning and error propagation, so that we can use machine learning as a great tool for global mapping, but take care of the limitations and try to approach them as best as possible with the tools that we develop here. Okay, so that was the short introduction into the area of applicability, and we have 5 minutes left for questions.
Good. Let me just go through the questions. So we need short answers from you then. So there is a question: do the units of variables matter for the calculation of the dissimilarity index?
No, because all variables are scaled.
Okay, good. That is a short. Have you tried log scaling the dissimilarity index?
No, not yet.
I also think it's a threshold, right? So it doesn't matter if you would log scale it. I mean, it's used as a threshold, so that doesn't. Is the random forest taking into account the data spatial dependence?
No, it's not taking the spatial dependence into account, not at all. So random forest doesn't care about the spatial dependence in the data. What we take into account via the spatial cross-validation is that we are selecting the variables in a way so that the model is able to make predictions for independent locations, and that we estimate the error for independent locations. But the random forest doesn't do that if we're not taking care of that ourselves.
Good. Would it be correct to assume that the area of applicability approach could be applied to evaluate performance of already available land use, land cover datasets and its utility to our case site?
Yeah, it could be used for that because we have, if the training data are available for the requirement is that we are not only having the map available that has been published, but we need the model, or at least we need the training data in order to estimate the area of applicability. If this is available, we could test if published data sets or models used to publish data sets are also applicable to our areas of interest.
Okay. Then there are two questions from Jakob about the dissimilarity index. Do you know how this index works in the case of having some categorical data as predictors?
Yeah, at the moment, we create dummy variables for categorical predictor variables. We didn't test it much. We got some feedback from some other groups who gave us some positive feedback. Yeah, but I guess that's still something to look into in more detail.
Has this idea been used for the reverse problem of finding locations that need more sampling?
Yeah, it has. For example, Maite from my group is using that to select training data.
Last minute, by the way. Last minute.
No, 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
2 minutes, yeah. So yeah, it has been used to find locations, or it has been used in some projects to find locations or to select samples so that samples can be selected in a way to maximize the area of applicability, so that each predictor, or that all predictor properties are covered in a training data set, so that we avoid that many parts of the study area are outside of the area of applicability.
Do you have recommendations for cases where label observations are clustered by nature? For instance, species occurrence models. Oh, I think that's a completely different chapter.
That's a complicated.
I think that's a different chapter of the book, I would say.
I think we cannot answer that within 1 minute.
Last question from Gerard. Thank you for the interesting lecture. Nice to see that spatial cross-validation can do some good in some cases. My question is, is there a relation between area of applicability and the regressor variable hull from statistics?
Yeah, so there have been some approaches of using some hulls for estimating the area of applicability. The problem with hulls is that we cannot account for gaps in the predictor space. But this is equally problematic in machine learning approaches because of the nonlinear relationship. So with hulls, we usually only look at the range of the data, but we cannot account for gaps in the predictor space.
Okay, good. Thanks a lot. It's 2 o'clock. So it's my job to thank you very much for this enlightening presentation and demonstration, Hannah. To everyone, I can recommend you to use the Mattermost for discussion, for questions. There are 2 in the chat now. So for the person who put them in the chat, please repost them in the Mattermost, because we can then follow up later on those, and they will be available after these sessions, right? Unlike the Zoom chat, which will disappear, and the Zoom questions will disappear after the Zoom session stops.
And also, Ezra, if I may interrupt, when you answer the questions, use the reply, because then you open a new thread. So every question, becomes like a discussion point, so you can follow.
Exactly. So don't put them as new messages to the channel, but use the thread possibility of replying to questions. Good. That is to every individual. Okay, then we continue with the second speaker of today. And the second speaker of today is Marius Appel. Marius is a research associate at the Institute for Geoinformatics of the University of Münster in Germany. His research focuses on developing and implementing methods for predicting global phenomena from massive data sets. And the topic that he will talk about today is analyzing massive amounts of Earth observation data in the cloud with R, GDAL cubes, and Stack. So go ahead, Marius.
Thanks, Esther, for the nice introduction, and also thanks to Tom and the whole OpenGeoHub team for the opportunity to present here and for doing all the organization. So yeah, let's start with some motivation. So first of all, there's a lot of data available on cloud computing platforms. So for example, there's this whole Sentinel-2 archive available on Amazon Web Services. And on the other hand, of course, there are also a lot of methods to process these data available. So think of R packages, where we now have like more than 18,000 packages on CRAN. However, we do not really want to spend much time on downloading a lot of data and spending time on data portals. So the question then is, how can we avoid these data downloads and make use of the data and method availability by simply moving our computations to the data, to the cloud, instead of downloading the data. And that's basically the objective of this workshop here. So I'd like to show you how we can analyze satellite image collections in the cloud with R using some technology like Stack, cloud optimized geotiffs, and GDAL cubes. So I'll start with an introduction and some slides about the basics of cloud computing, how the Earth observation data is provided in the cloud. And then I'll introduce some technologies, including Stack, COGS, and GDAL cubes. Then I'll come to a live demonstration and 2 examples. One with a relatively simple analysis on how to create composite images, and second on really doing more complex time series analysis. And then afterwards, I hope there will be enough time for some discussion. And all the materials that I'm using here, the slides and also the R Markdown document is available on this GitHub repository here. So, okay, let's start with what I mean with doing things in the cloud. So that actually can mean different things. And one is that we could simply use services running in the cloud. So one example is if you use Google Earth Engine in your browser, or similar services like Sentinel-Hub or some other backends from the OpenGeoHub project, then you, of course, doing the processing in the cloud because the services run in the cloud, right? But it's also possible to use the cloud more like an infrastructure, or as an infrastructure to do your own things, where you really run machines on cloud infrastructure providers. And examples of these providers include Amazon Web Services, which is the largest one, AWS, but also Google Cloud Platform, Microsoft Azure, and some more specific Earth observation-oriented platforms like the Copernicus Diasis. And here in this tutorial, we will use and run a custom machine on AWS to analyze satellite imagery in the cloud. So that means we really have to manage the whole infrastructure by our own. But of course, that means also that we are pretty flexible in what we do there. So to give you an idea what data is available on these platforms, so on Amazon Web Services, there's an archive of Sentinel and Landsat data, but also climate reanalysis data from ERA5, OpenStreetMap data, and also climate model output, and of course a lot of more. On Google Cloud Platform, there's also the Landsat archive, the Sentinel archive, and one nice thing there is that you can directly access the collections from the Google Earth Engine data catalog. And as a further example, the Copernicus diocese, they have somewhat focused on Sentinel data, of course, but they also contain more data that depends on which particular diocese you are using. So as I said, we're using AWS here, and let's start with a very, very quick introduction into AWS here. So the cloud, of course, is not only a single data center, but it's really a lot of data centers distributed over the world. And they distributed into several regions. So there are 25 regions in total currently. So for examples include US West in Oregon, EU Central in Frankfurt, but also in Asia Pacific, Sydney. And each of these regions is not only a single data center, but consists of a few data centers which they call availability zones. That makes sure that really the services are highly available. So these availability zones are like independent data centers which are completely isolated from each other. So in total, we have 81 availability zones. And what you need to know when you want to run a machine on AWS is that you basically using the basic service EC2, which means Amazon Elastic Compute Cloud. So that's the basic service to do that. And then you have to follow the basic steps. So at first you have to select a region and the machine instant type. And that's can be time consuming because there are a lot of different machine instant types with lots of with different number of CPUs, main memory, network performance, and all that stuff. But of course, they also differ in costs and in their operating systems. So they are like these predefined Amazon machine images, which are like operating systems, but sometimes they also include pre-installed software like TensorFlow for doing deep learning in the cloud also. So once you selected a region in the machine instance type, you basically create a key pair to access the machine once it is running over SSH and for security reasons. And then you can basically follow the instructions and click launch instance. And then when the machine is running, you can connect via SSH and install some software. Here, you need to install some typical spatial libraries. System libraries are RStudio Server, which is RStudio basically running in a browser. And then, of course, R packages, everything what you need. So this is the basic steps to run a machine on AWS. But of course, if you really want to know more, there are a lot of tutorials out there, especially what you need to do if you want to follow some or fulfill some security considerations. So let's just have a quick look at the AWS management console, which is how you basically run your machines and manage your machines and stop it. So let's click here, and then we come to the browser. So that is my account here, and then I can go to EC2. And I see my instances, and I have 3 instances, and one is running. So that's the one we're going to use later on to do our live demonstration. And then you basically can click on the instance and see some statistics. And also you could stop it here, which I'm not going to do now. Or you could also go back and say, I want to launch a new instance. Then you can select the operating system. So I'm mostly using Ubuntu server. And then you can select the machine instance type. So this is a nice list of how many CPUs they have and so on. And then basically you follow the instructions, and in the end, you have a running machine. So let's go back to the slides. Now that we have running a machine in the cloud, so we may need to know where the data actually is and how to access it. So we want to load some images, some satellite images, and process them. So the question is, how is that organized? And the answer to that is that it's different to just local storage on your machine, because these machines you're running in the cloud, they have kind of local storage, which is called elastic block storage. But these really big data archives use this highly scalable object storage technology called S3, Simple Storage Service. And just to give you a quick definition of the basic terms, because you read them quite often, so a bucket is a container for objects that is stored on a specific AWS region. Objects are like individual files, and they contain also a couple of metadata within a bucket. And these objects or files are identified by a unique key, and that's basically file names or a path. And these names are unique within a bucket. So some words about the pricing. So by default, if you, the owner of such an S3 bucket pays for storage, transfer, and requests. But there are some special buckets called requester pays buckets. And then especially for open data sets, where then the transfer costs and the request costs have to be paid by the user of the data, by you. So that's important to know. So let's look at some examples. So this is a bucket of Sentinel-2 data on AWS. So we see a description here, which is nice. We see that this is a requester pays bucket. So users have to pay for requests and data transfer. And then we also get a lot of information and tutorials how to use these data from this bucket. So that's nice and useful. Okay, so back to the slides. So this is an example for an object. And what you see is that this is really like a URL. You see the object, the bucket name, and then the path pointing to the file. And if I click on this link, then it really would download the TIFF file locally to my computer, because this is an open bucket. So as I said, so buckets are not like a drive on your machine, and the data access mostly works over HTTP requests. So similar to what you do when you call a website in your browser. And that involves a couple of challenges. And one is that it's not so easy to find images by location, time, and other criteria, which of course we need to do later on in our analysis. And the second is that it's not so obvious how to transfer the data efficiently over HTTP. So for instance, if I only want to access some parts of an image, then that I don't need to download the full image first before I can then do my analysis. So that's two questions I'm going to address now. So now we know basically where the data is, and we have a running machine, but we need to find data for our analysis. So and that's where what Stack is basically doing. So Stack is a spatial temporal asset catalog, and it's like a standardized JSON-based language for describing catalogs of spatial temporal data. So in most cases, this is satellite imagery, but it's really also suitable for describing point cloud sets or radar data sets. And it's extensible, so there are extensions available for observation data, for data cubes, for point clouds, and some more. Stack is pretty young actually, but it's already quite stable. So there's a 1.0 release available since May this year, and it really has a growing ecosystem. So there's a lot of software out there using Stack, and that can be useful to also generate Stack catalogs. So let's see how Stack looks like in this figure here. So at the lowest level, there are Stack items. Stack items are these inseparable objects of data and metadata, and they contain these so-called assets, and they are really like links to our files in the cloud. So an item would be, for instance, a single satellite image, and then this may contain of one or more assets for the TIFF files, really. And then these can be grouped using collections and catalogs. So catalogs can also be nested. So that means that we can have a catalog of catalogs, and collections can be useful to group metadata. So for instance, the license of all Sentinel-2 images is the same. So it would make sense to group items to a collection and then put the license metadata into the collection instead of every image. So most catalogs are static stack catalogs, which is typically a set of linked JSON files online on a server. And that starts with a root catalog JSON file, and then this catalog JSON file contains links to other collections, nested catalogs or items. And then the items, as I said, contain really the links to the URLs and the files. So the problem here is that this is not enough for what we want to do, because it's not possible to search by bounding box, polygon, area of interest, or whatever. Let's anyway look at one example here. This is a Lancet static catalog. So that starts with a catalog JSON, and this is a graphical illustration of these JSON files powered by a Stack browser. And then we can basically navigate through the catalog, and we see that this catalog has a subcatalog, Lancet 8 L1. And then this has a set of, again, subcatalogs organized by the Lancet tile grid by rows and columns. And then you see a lot of catalogs. And at some point, you see a lot of items. So, and then every image from that particular Lancet tile in the Lancet grid is a stack item here. And then I can click on one of the items, and then I see some metadata and preview image, and really get like band metadata about the spectral bands, and also the links. So if you look at the bottom left, you see that this is really pointing to where the data is, or the object is located on Amazon S3. So that's nice. And also there's a lot of other metadata on spectral bands, but also on, for instance, here, cloud coverage of the scene, and yeah, other important metadata. Okay, so then there's Stack API, and this is a web service implementation for dynamic search of stack items by area of interest, datetime, and other metadata. And that's basically what we need here. So we can really ask the server, give me all stack items of a particular collections that intersect with my area of interest, that have been recorded in a datetime range, and maybe some other metadata. And that's what we need, and that is compliant with the OGC standard AP features. And a good starting point, if you haven't worked with Stack yet, is the stackindex.org website, which is developed by a colleague of mine, Matthias Mohr, here in Münster. This is basically listing a lot of available catalogs, and you can filter by catalog type, whether it's a static catalog or it's an API service. And then you see basically all the server endpoints, and that's of course very useful for practice. Okay, let's go on. So Stack basically solves the problem how to find the data in the cloud. Now another problem is that the image file formats must be cloud friendly, because what we pay in the cloud is transfer and costs. And also the time is sometimes annoying if the image file formats are not cloud friendly. And one file format which does this very well and is very cloud friendly is cloud optimized GeoTIFF COG. So this is essentially a normal GeoTIFF file with some specific file organization. So it's organized in tiles. So that means that you store the image data in blocks. And the file follows a specific order of data and metadata. And so that's actually not so interesting to read all the details, but as a result, cloud optimized GeoTIFFs support efficient HTTP range requests. So that means that I can only request parts of a file over HTTP. And that's of course very useful if I have if I only want to access a small part of an image or read images at lower resolution, then this is really efficient, and I don't need to transfer a lot of additional data that I actually do not need. And then GeoTIFF, cloud optimized GeoTIFFs of course support compression, and typically they also include these overview images, so images on the same image on lower resolution, which is nice to get this Google Earth Engine-like interactivity where you can quickly run stuff on low resolution first, and then in the end deploy your final model or method and apply it on full resolution. So the good news is that there's a geospatial data abstraction library, GDAL, and that can efficiently read and write cloud-optimized geotiffs. And also GDAL can access object storage in the cloud directly with so-called virtual file systems. So that means that we have everything to create, read, cloud-optimized geotiffs, and access the imagery and transfer it to our machine in the cloud. So the next thing we want to do is then creating data cubes out of a set of images, basically, because we're not only interested in single images from Sentinel-2, but we really want to analyze satellite image collections. And therefore, the problem with satellite imagery always is that images are basically aligned very irregularly in space and time. So that means that images spatially overlap. They have different coordinate reference systems coming from different UTM zones, for instance. They sometimes have different pixel sizes depending on spectral bands. And if you really want, analyze larger areas, then the resulting time series is pretty much irregular. So one idea to make this easier is to represent the data as a data cube. So here, this figure shows a specific 4-dimensional regular raster data cube. So that has 4 dimensions, 2 for space, 1 for time, and 1 for variable or spectral band. And then this is essentially a 4-dimensional array where we collect all observations in one object, and then every combination of dimension values yields a single number. And this data cube has a single coordinate reference system. The cells have a constant temporal duration and also spatial size. And that's a very convenient data structure because then things like time series analysis really become easy. If we create data cubes from satellite image collections, we have to be aware of the fact that that means we lose some of the information because we're doing a lot of resampling. So the steps are that we first need to think of our target data cube and think about how our data cube should look like, the geometry, so what spatial extent, what temporal extent, what spatial resolution, what temporal resolution, and so on. Then we need to basically process all the images and warp them in space. So that means reprojection, rescaling, and cropping. And then afterwards, so for example, if we have a data cube where one cell represents a month of data, then we would also need to apply some temporal aggregation because we often have more observations in 1 month. And then we need to do a pixel-wise aggregation, for example, to compute a median value by month or so. And also we have to be aware that there is no something like a single correct data cube because really these parameters can be chosen with regard to particular analysis. Okay, one library and R package that can do these things is GDAL cubes. That's basically written in C++, but mostly useful from R actually. So that is available from CRAN, and it allows the creation but also the processing of data cubes from satellite image collections. So the image data is read on the fly when needed. It's multi-threaded and it does computations chunk-wise, which means that it does not try to read the whole Sentinel data into the main memory, but it's really processing well in smaller chunks. So GDAL cubes is highly built on GDAL to read and warp the data, and it has some additional features. One is that it allows to apply user-defined R functions on pixels or pixel time series. We can use pixel masks and also combine data from different image collections. But we'll see that in a minute in the practical part. Right, so let's come to the practical part and see the live examples. So this is the URL of the rendered R Markdown document, the HTML. I'm going to change to our Studio server now, and this is running in the cloud. So if you look here, you see an IP address. That's the IP address we just saw in the AWS management console. If I click here, you see that basically this is a, whoops. This is the machine here. Okay, so I go through the R Markdown document. If you want to follow, I think it's easiest if you look at the rendered HTML output on GitHub. So let's start, well, basically with the introduction here. So first of all, if we want to reproduce these things, actually it's really it makes sense only if you're using your own machine on AWS because the data is there. Maybe it would work otherwise because it's I'm using public data, but it would be terribly slow, I guess, because it would don't really download all the data to your local machine. And that's not the idea of the whole workshop here. So yeah, basically what I'm showing you is how the R packages RStack and GDAL cubes can be used to analyze and process Sentinel-2 data in the cloud on this AWS instance. So in the first part, we will see how to create some composite images, and in the second part, we will apply some more complex time series images. So I'm using a couple of other packages, including stars, tmap, SF, and color space. But really the focus is on RStack and GDAL cubes. So the examples here have been selected to yield computation times that are acceptable for this live presentation, but of course it's possible to do it with much larger data sets. And therefore, please try it out if you're interested in that. So for the first example, we want to create composite images, and we have a study area that is given in a geopackage file. It's the mainland area of the Netherlands. As a first step, we simply create a map and visualize the geopackage file. So we use SF and read the shape with the geopackage file and use a tmap package and create an interactive map and do a very simple interactive map here. And then this is what we see. So this is the mainland area. So it's really poorly digitized. So this doesn't look good, but it's only for illustration purposes here. So let's look at what the coordinate reference system, and this is what comes out. It's a European Lambert equal area projection. And this is important because the next step, what we do is we want to use the RStack package to query available Sentinel-2 images for June 2018. So the aim is that we want to create something like a cloud-free composite image for June 2018 for the whole land area of the Netherlands. And therefore, to find images in that area in time of interest, we use a stack search function from the RStack package. And that takes a couple of arguments, and one is the bounding box argument, but that's expected to be in latitude longitude values. So what we first need to do is we store the bounding box using the stBounding box function from the SF package. And then we basically transform it to latitude longitude, so to EPSG 4326, and then store the result as another object. So I'm using this native pipe, which is a replacement of the old pipe with a percentage sign. So what it does is actually it takes the expression on the left-hand side and passes this as the first argument to the function on the right-hand side. And that's nice to write down chains of operations, basically. So the result is then our bounding box in WGS84. And then we can use that to query images with our stack. So first of all, we provide the stack API endpoint. We load the package, and then we use the stack function to specify the endpoint. And then basically we use this endpoint provided to the stack search function and provide the name of our collection. So that's a stack collection object here. Provide the bounding box, provide the datetime range, and say that we want to request up to 500 images. So the default is given by the server, and in this case, it would mean that we only get up to 10 images per request, but therefore I increase the limit here. So let's run it. So that sends a request to the stack endpoint, and then we can print the items, and we see that we got 260 images. So that's, I think, quite a lot, but of course, some of them are not really useful because they're full of clouds or so. But anyway, so I think it's worth to look at the structure of the items object of the result. And this is basically a list, and with the element features, which is again a list containing all the images or all the stack items. And let's look at one of them. And then you see that this is again a list, and then which has elements properties, assets, bounding box, and a few others. And that's all the metadata I've just shown you in the static catalog example. So, for example, we have assets here for all the spectral bands, basically. And then if I print one of them, you really see that there's an there's a reference pointing to the data on the S3 bucket in the cloud to the TIFF file. And that's nice. And of course, it's also nice that we can access metadata as a properties element of these features. So for example, the cloud coverage, which in this case is 0. So good. So that's basically what we do with our stack here. So we use our stack to query images by area of interest and time. And now we continue using the GDALcubes package. Because in the GDALcubes package in the latest version, there's a stack image collection function that takes the items features, so the result of these stack requests, as argument and then produces a GDALcubes image collection. So that's an object which basically is an index that knows where which image is located and how bands relate to individual files. And that's quite easy to use. So we can use load the GDALcubes package and then create a collection using the stack image collection object. It provides the features, and then we can print the image collection, and we see that basically we have 260 images and 18 bands here, which is basically based on what stack gave us. That's the default implementation. There's some issue with this because, for instance, if you want to use the SCL bands, the scene classification layer, which has important information about cloud coverage of individual pixels, or whether they contain clouds or cloud shadows or so, then it's not here. And this is because the stack reply did not provide us with these EO bands metadata about the SCL band. So that's might be a problem here. And another problem might be that there are a lot of images that are full of clouds here. So it would be nice to filter basically by cloud coverage, by the metadata. And we can do both of these issues and solve it in the stack image collection function by using the asset names argument and the property filter argument. So in this case, we provide an explicit list of asset names that we want to use. And that means that we include the SCL band here, and we provide a function property filter that basically takes all stack of the properties of all stack items as input, and then evaluates a logical expression. In this case, we filter by cloud coverage and say that we only want to keep images with less than 20%. And then our collection is probably a bit reduced. So we get some warning because the SCL band does not include the stack metadata, which I mentioned. But anyway, that's not a problem. And then if we print the collection, the GDALcubes image collection, we see that we now have 92 images and also the scene classification layer band. So that's nice. And now we can basically build a data cube. So what we need to do in GDALcubes now is that we create or define the data cube geometry, and that's what we call a data cube view. And the function to do that is a cube view. So we create a Netherlands overview data cube view. So we specify the spatial reference system. This is the Lambert equal area projection. We say that one pixel has resolution 200 by 200 meter in space. So it's really like a coarse overview image only. And then we say that we want to aggregate 1 month of data or 30 days. And we define that we combine images in time by median aggregation. So that means if we have several values for the same pixel within the month, we're taking the median of all the valid values. And then resampling in space is done by averaging cells that would fall within the same cell in space. And then I'm specifying the extent based on the bounding box we've computed. I'm adding a kilometer to each side here. And then I'm also saying, I'm interested in the data from June 1st to June 30, 2018, and then it's basically our geometry of the data cube. So that is independent from particular image collections and therefore also doesn't relate to the spectral bands of the data. So in this case, the data cube only has one pixel in time because we're just aggregating 1 month here, and 1,600 pixels almost in Y direction and a little less in the X direction. Okay, so if you look here, you see that you get these warning-like messages, but that simply tells us that, well, the size of pixels and the extent do not really align. So that means that we would end with half a pixel or so, or parts of a pixel. And that means that the extent basically has been increased slightly to make sure that we end up with complete pixels. Okay, so now we have the geometry of a data cube and the image collection in GDAL cubes. So then we can use a raster cube function to really create our data cube. And let's go to the script. First of all, I'm creating a mask. So that means that we can use the SCL band here as an image mask. And we say that we ignore pixels which have values of the SCL band 3, 8, 9. So 3 stands for cloud shadows. 8 is something like a cloud medium probability, and a 9 cloud high cloud probability. So that means that we want to ignore clouds basically, and can we find out from the official documentation of the data. So we use this mask. We tell GDAL cubes that we're going to use up to 16 threads, and then basically we combine everything in the raster cube function. So the image collection, the data cube view, and the mask. We then pass this to the select bands function, which just subsets the available spectral bands. So we're only interested in RGB here. We then filter by our polygon, which simply sets NA values outside of the polygon. And then we plot the results with, well, basically the black point being represented, or 0 representing the black point and 1,500 representing the white point of the data. So let's run it, and then it's probably taking some time, because actually it's although we use coarse resolution here, it's still based on 92 Sentinel-2 images, so it's not nothing basically. So, but anyway, it's also not taking.
Are you running in parallel?
Yeah, that's in parallel. Yes. So that uses up to 16 threads. So let's see here what's going on, and then I think we should end up with a nice plot. So yeah, that took 34 seconds, and then we end up with this nice RGB image of the Netherlands. So yeah, if we want to process a very small area, we could also do that by simply using a different data cube view. So in this case, we're overwriting parts of the data cube view from the whole Netherlands. So we use 10 meter spatial resolution and only use well, this specific area, and that relates to Amsterdam, or the city center of Amsterdam. So let's also do this, and then wait for the results. And then I think that also should be fast. Yeah, so that's basically Amsterdam in June 2018. Okay, so the package also comes with a lot of operations to process data cubes. One is apply pixel, which evaluates arithmetic expressions on band values in the data cube. We've seen filter geometry by polygons. We can filter pixel by logical expressions. We can combine data cubes that are identically shaped. And also we could apply reducer functions over space and time, which I'm going to do in the second example. And then some more, which are not so important here. And then furthermore, we can, of course, export or write data cubes as netcdf files or cloud optimized GeoTIFF files. We can read data cubes from netcdf files, compute summary statistics over polygons or zonal statistics. And also we can query data cube values by irregular spatial temporal points and well, simply create animations, all that stuff. So I'm showing you another example what we can do. So now it's not an RGB composite, but we're calculating the NDVI. and use a nice looking color palette for that. So we use the color space package and define a green-yellow palette. And I'm going to reverse the scale here because low NDVI values should be yellowish and then high NDVI values greenish. So what I'm going to do here is that I'm using bands 4 and 8, so in red and near infrared, filter by the polygon, and then apply an arithmetic expression to calculate the NDVI value, and then filter pixels that have positive NDVI values. So to exclude some more water pixels or similar, and then I plot the result using the color scale, and then it's probably taking also 20 seconds or so, or maybe a bit more. And so let's wait for that.
And Marius, is the apply pixel, is that running in C code or is it running in R?
It's running in C, so that you see that this expression is given as a string, right? And that translates to a C expression parser, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's what you get. So that's a basic image of the Netherlands NDVI. And then you can see that the filter pixel expression here makes sure that there's some additional water area left out, or basically it's set to an A here. Okay, so if we want to plot interactive maps, I'm showing this example here. I'm doing exactly the same here, calculating the NDVI, but then I'm converting the result to a stars object. So from the stars package and using the tmap, use a tmap package for plotting, and then I basically get an interactive map. And the nice thing is here that GDataCubes realizes that this is the data cube we've just created already, so that more or less has been cached, and so it doesn't really compute everything again. So, and then you see you get an interactive map, but of course you also see that the spatial resolution is poor because we only used like 200 meters. Okay, so that was the first example. I think that has shown how we can basically use the packages RStack and GDataCubes to work directly in the cloud and do our analysis there, and yeah, really use the advantages that we have access to all of the data there. And also one nice thing is that really if you want to study a different area or want to apply the same as to a different area, it's really easy to change. And therefore, if you're really researching different methods, so it's also, I think this is an advantage to check also the transferability of methods, because you can really easily check really other study areas and how the performance is there. Okay, so let's go on with the second example quickly. This is time series analysis. Basically, the procedure is the same. So we use RStack to filter images and then use GDataCubes for the processing. So this is a very small area located in the southeast of Berlin, forest area. So what we do now is, yeah, we query images with RStack again. So we define our stack endpoint. It's the same as before. We use the bounding box, which is already in latitude longitude, and then we basically perform our stack request. In this case, we're interested in all images between well, January 2016 to December 2020. So that we can really do time series analysis later on. And then looking at the items, we see that this is 457 images. So that's a lot. And if we look at the range of time of the images, we see that the earliest image has been captured in November 2016. And the last one was in December 2020. So it seems that there are no images available before November 2016 in this collection of cloud-optimized geotiffs. Okay, so the next step is that we create a monthly Sentinel-2 data cube. In this case, it's really a time series data cube, so it has not only one cell in time. So we're doing the same steps here. So we define our assets by name. To be able to use the scene classification layer band, we filter cloud cover. In this case, we accept all images that have less than 50% cloud coverage. And then let's see what comes out. We end up with a GDataCubes image collection with 200 images. So the nice thing here is really that Stack already has all the metadata that GDACubes needs. If you use GDACubes to process the images locally, if you have a local archive of data, then it needs to open all the files once and read and extract metadata out of them. But in this case, Stack is really enough to generate these image collections. So it's also quite fast to convert the Stack response to an image collection object. Okay, so now the result, so we convert our bounding box to work in the UTM zone from now on. So we specify our data cube view. Again, we use 10 meter spatial resolution here and 1 month temporal duration of one cell. And so that means our data cube has not so many pixels in space, but 60 pixels in time, so 60 months. And then what we do now is that we first create a data cube and store it as a netcdf file. So let me first remove the netcdf file if it's already available. And then we're basically doing, applying a mask again, and again tell GDACube to use up to 16 threads and to compress netcdf files. And then we are basically using only the red and the near infrared bands, filter by the geometry, and then write the nets to a netcdf file, and then start the processing. Yeah, so in this case, I think it's taking a bit longer because it's really 200 images that need to be opened and read, or partially read at least. So it's taking some time, but we can, I think, go on and see what we're going to do now. So the next step is that we reduce our data cube over space and time to get some initial impression of our data. So this is like really computing simple summary statistics over dimensions. So in this case here, we simply load our data cube from the existing netcdf file, which is currently being created. Then compute the NDVI. And then we apply a function, or 3 functions basically, over all NDVI time series, which returns the minimum, the maximum, and the mean NDVI values. And then we're plotting the results. So let's wait until the netcdf file has been generated, and then run it. But yeah, I can tell you that there are a couple of built-in reducers here for the reduced time function that include minimum, mean, median, max, count, sum, variance, and standard deviation. But we will see in a minute that it's also possible to apply R functions as reducers here. And that opens up quite a lot of possibilities.
How is your RAM usage now?
I don't know. I can check probably. I mean, it's on AWS, right? Let me check. Can I see it here? So it's only like 4%. Okay. 1.3 gigabytes, if I understand correctly here.
And what's the estimate? How much of the input data are you processing?
I don't know exactly, really.
You have a number of images and average size of image or something, then you multiply. Well, it's just a question, but probably it's much larger, right?
Yeah. Of course, yeah. Okay, so I hope it has finished. Yeah, it has. So next step is then, I guess, much faster, because the data cube is already there. So yeah, so now it's really not loading the data from the S3 bucket, but really from the netcdf file, which is already there. So data transfer is not really a problem now again. And so yeah, we see minimum, maximum, mean NDVI summarized over time. And we can do the same over space and then get time series. Where basically all the slices of the data cube have been summarized by a reducer. Okay, so the next step, we may want to do some change analysis and change detection. So I thought, why not using the bfast monitor package from the famous bfast package? So that is an unsupervised change detection method. that is quite successful and useful, but also computationally intensive. And as I said, it's possible to apply user-defined reducers. And I'm showing you this example, how to do it, and then look at the results in the HTML maybe, because I think that's taking 3 minutes or so, and I think let's leave that time for discussion in the end. So yeah, as I said, so we use the NetCDF file as a data cube, and then we apply a custom reducer function. And so we first have to say how many bands does the output have, because the reducer could, well, produce a single value or 2 values, or we don't know. So that must be defined by the user. In this case, bfast monitor returns change date and change magnitude. And then I'm calculating basically a vegetation index. In this case, I use the recently proposed k-NDVI, which is a generalization of the NDVI, which is nonlinear, and that seems to be very cool. And then I'm basically preparing everything for bfast monitor. So I'm converting time series to a TS object, and then I'm running bfast monitor on that time series. And that's also run in parallel then, and I can, well, then export the result again as a data cube as an NetCDF file. So that takes 3 minutes, as I said, simply because bfast monitor is really computationally expensive. But in principle, it's not so difficult to apply any other time series analysis functions from other R packages here. The only important thing is that you really have to make sure that you're handling errors, and especially NA cases. So for the Earth observation data, you often have really time series that are completely NA. And so it's important to handle these cases and then return something meaningful like NAs, that it's not crashing everything. Okay, so let's switch to the rendered HTML output. And then just quickly look at the results from bfast monitor. So yeah, that's the result with a change date. And what we see is that, yeah, the results need a lot of post-processing probably, but we see this large block of changes, which is related to what has been going on there since, I don't know, 2 years or so, because they built the new Tesla Gigafactory there. This is some deforested area where the Tesla Gigafactory is being built. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. So I'd like to mention some advantages and disadvantages of this approach, using really the cloud infrastructure and launching a machine there for analyzing Earth observation data. So one point which is important is that the whole workflow I've shown you is based on the existence of Stake API services and imagery as cloud optimized geotiffs. And of course, not all data collections are provided as COGS, and there may be no Stack API endpoint for some data. That's definitely a problem, but I think more and more data providers are really realizing that this is super useful, and there are going to be more services deployed in the next years. So some advantages are clearly that we have access to huge data archives, and it's the most flexible approach. So we have our own machine there, so we can do whatever we basically want, or as we do on our local machine. There are also a lot of powerful machines available in the cloud with 96 cores or so. And it's, well, the analysis has been really based on open source software only. But of course, there are a lot of disadvantages too. So one is that it's not free. So I'm paying now with my credit card for these things. So it's, although it's really less than $1 per hour. But anyway, compared to Google Earth Engine, of course, Google Earth Engine and others are much easier to use, and some are even free for researchers. And also your institution's computing center might have even more computing resources. So at least in Münster here, we have a large cluster with powerful GPUs and all that stuff. And I can use that for free. So of course, that makes sense to use it. But that depends a bit on the data volume and the complexity of the method I'm applying. So it's not so easy to decide actually. And then of course, I need to set up the machine on my own and of course need to familiarize with the cloud itself. Okay, so as a summary, I think we've seen that there's a lot of data provided on cloud computing platforms, but we also have to take care how the data is stored. And
maybe we can switch to questions because of the time. I'm sorry.
We can. Thank you, Tom.
Yes.
Good idea.
I'm
yeah.
Sorry, it's just because of the time. We are very strict, and there's a lot of questions. So maybe Edzer, you can switch to questions.
Oh, that would be nice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was excellent.
Let me just find the unmute button. Yes, thank you, Tom. Yeah, thanks, Marius. There's a couple of questions that came up. Let me just go through them in order. There was one on the Zoom. I understand that the images used for the time series analysis are level 1. Correct me if I'm wrong. So how can we incorporate the atmospheric correction within the cloud image processing procedure?
I think it has been level 2A. But if that is not the case, you would need to do that on your own before, and that's probably a lot of work. Yes.
But in principle, the level 2A collections are also available, right, as COGS?
Yes, luckily, yes. So let's see. Let's make sure. So yeah, the endpoint is really sent into 2 level 2A COGS.
Yeah. So it's cloud corrected. Good. Yeah. Another question, in terms of costs, advantages and disadvantages, could you share how each of the cloud services you mentioned compare against each other? Which is possibly more user-friendly for folks new to using virtual machines?
In terms of cost, it's very hard to compare because they have different pricing models and also different data available. So I can only tell what I pay for this example. So I have a machine here with 16 CPU cores and I don't know, I think 32 gigabytes of RAM, and that costs me like 60 cents per hour plus storage, but that's not so much actually. Mm-hmm. One point I haven't been talking about is that it's a good idea if you use a machine that is very close to the data. So the Sentinel COGS are available in the Oregon region, and it's a good idea also to use a machine there. And that is basically because you get faster data transfers, but also for these requester paste buckets, it's cheaper there, or if not free. I'm not 100% sure here. But
yeah, that was what I asked. How expensive is this requester paste thing? But that is really like millicents per request or something like that, right?
Yeah, at least if you're in the same region.
Yeah, in the same region, it's very cheap. Yeah. Let me see here. What is the role of DataCube?
The role of a DataCube is that you organize the satellite image collection and that you have a nice processing interface how you can run time series analysis. Because otherwise, I mean, it's not, I mean, the images overlap and have different map projections. So that's, you need to organize them somehow to be able to treat them as one object. And the DataCube is one idea to do that.
Okay, good. A question from Tom. What is your general recommendation for people developing large raster datasets? How to install, set up, stack, and register the data so it's available for easy access via your GDAL cubes?
I would say it's really crucial to have a running Stack API server on service. So that is most important that you.
So you install your own. You install your own, or you use some third party?
I mean, if you're the data provider, then it makes sense that you do that on your own.
Okay.
Right, and then you can add them to the stack index, right? You can sort of add your own collections, and it will find it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Another question from Tom: is it possible to use your GDAL cubes from Python, or even better, directly from Bash?
From Python, no. From Bash, well, not super useful. I have a very basic command line client that can run data cube operations, but it's not really like the main, it hasn't been the main focus of development.
You like the integration with Stack and so on, right? You want to sort of collect that and use R to do that and to process that, I think, right?
Okay. So yeah, that would be useful and possible, I think.
Good. Last question that just came up. Could you please again explain how one can set up and run RStudio processing environments directly on an AWS virtual machine, or maybe due to time limitations, provide some sources or guidances and setup?
Yeah, I can write something and maybe post to Mattermost. I think that would be easiest.
Okay, good. Will GDAL cubes be able to read standard netcdf file in the future?
Well, it can read netcdf files as long as GDAL can read netcdf files. I mean, it's not supporting like high-dimensional netcdf files as from climate model output or so that's not possible.
Oh, I think it does actually. GDAL does. It will just wrap everything in bands, right? You don't get the dimensions pretty, but you get everything as, you know, a big stack of bands with a lot of metadata where you can.
Yeah, I think that depends a lot on the particular data sets. So for Modus, for instance, which is not netcdf but HDF, so it's possible, but then you need to deal a bit with the subdata sets and so on.
Yeah. Okay, with an eye on the clock, Marius, thank you very much for this enlightening presentation. I personally got now and then a little bit confused about the two meanings of cloud. You talked about cloud removal and compute clouds and so on. We need colors for that, or different words or so at some stage, right? But it was very interesting. So with an eye on the program, we can now move to this, what was it? To this...
just a second,
under me thing, right?
Yeah, just a second, we will go now. We will stop live streaming. I just want to take all the presenters. And don't forget the second block, you have to reconnect to the Zoom. So the people following from YouTube and connecting to Zoom, don't forget, you will have to connect to a second block, which is starting in 15 minutes. Don't forget, you have to reconnect. So not on this Zoom link, but on another Zoom link. So it's another session.